Throughout the entire 2016 presidential campaign, it seemed like a certainty that Hillary Clinton would be the next president of the United States. However, as votes were being sent in from all over the nation, things started to change.
Donald Trump, we project, will win in Kentucky with its 8 electoral votes, in Indiana with its 11 electoral votes, West Virginia.
One by one, Donald Trump began to win states that he was expected to lose. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida all went Republican. But most surprisingly of all, Wisconsin and Michigan, 2 states which were considered surefire wins for Clinton, were won by Trump.
CNN now projects that Donald Trump will carry the state of Wisconsin. He will win Wisconsin with its 10 electoral votes. He's cracked the so-called blue wall.
So what happened? Why was everyone so wrong? In almost every election in the United States, statewide and national, polls are virtually never an accurate representation of the voting population. This misrepresentation of voters is usually a result of both pollster bias as well as the outdated methods of polling. A general bias that exists in every national election is emphasized by polls from different news media outlets like MSNBC and Fox News. As expected, national polls from MSNBC and Fox News tend to lean more liberal and conservative respectively, due to the majority of their audience who watch their program and participate in the polling. In the 2016 election specifically, these pollster errors were quite prevalent prior to the election day on November 6th. According to a Washington Post article from 2016, the use of automated and live interviewers in the swing state of Pennsylvania also created a bias, this time from the voters. They found that those who were interviewed by real people swayed more in favor of Clinton, while those whose interviewers were automated voices leaned more towards Trump. Similar to the telephone polls in Pennsylvania, they also found that Trump voters were not very representative in mail-in polls compared to Clinton supporters. This raises the question of why were Trump voters not as actively participating in election polling and surveys than Clinton supporters?
Another reason behind the unsuccessful nature of these polls was the fact that many Trump supporters were simply not comfortable with expressing their views to pollsters. Because many people who do not respond to the polls do so because of anti-institutional sentiment they may have, this made it much more likely that these non-responders were Trump supporters. The high levels of non-response bias contributed to the inaccuracy of the polls. However, in some situations, people who did answer the polls were not honest about who they supported. According to the owner of the Susquehanna poll, Jim Lee, half of the surveys were done by live interviewers found Clinton winning by 8. The automated interviews had Trump winning by 2. These people have been called shy Trumpers because of their unwillingness to be public about their Trump support. This is because support for Trump was painted as something that was socially undesirable, and therefore people were embarrassed to admit their support for him. Trump also performed slightly better on online polls where it is much easier for people to remain anonymous while responding to the polls. While this most likely had very little effect on national polls, it did play a part in many state polls, especially in more liberal states. The shy Trumper takes some blame off the pollsters, but they also highlight problems with the method of administering these polls.
The next reason is that national polls don't account for electoral college. Each state has a number of electors equal to the number of its members in the U.S. House of Representatives, determined by a census of the state's population plus its 2 senators. National polls consider only people's vote of nationwide presidential election and don't usually show electoral college vote counts. A candidate can win the most votes nationally but lose the election because of the system of electoral college. For example, a candidate wins a state by a small margin and that state has a lot of electoral votes. That candidate would still receive all of the electoral votes. So if a candidate wins in California by a small margin, they get all 55 of California's electoral votes. That same candidates may lose in other smaller states by large margins and receive fewer popular votes than his or her opponent. But that candidate would still have the edge in the electoral college. In 2016 election, there were 3 states Trump won narrowly over Clinton, which are Wisconsin, Florida, and Pennsylvania. These states decided on their presidential choice in the final week of the election. This means in the final week of election, there happened a big change in the result because all the electors in those states voted to Trump, even if Trump narrowly won Clinton. So this led to the failure of prediction. Attempts have been made to fix this, for example, by aggregating smaller state and country level polls and then forecasting actual electoral college votes from those aggregates, but they are still not entirely accurate.
While there is no denying that most pollsters got everything wrong about the 2016 election, this begs the question, does there need to be a complete rewrite of polling methods? The answer, yes and no. Old polling methods are no longer applicable with our modern society. More thought must be put into how random samples are obtained and the level of representation required for different groups. The polls may have been wrong, but they weren't that far off. This raises the question, did we think Clinton was going to win because there was bad data, or did we ignore the data because we all thought Clinton was going to win? A lot of issues with polling and bias need to be resolved before the next election so that the country, once again, won't be thrown into shock.